Greetings, and welcome to this brief introduction to Plato's dialogue, the Cratylus. The Cratylus is more than a little puzzling. On the one hand, it takes up fundamental philosophic questions, such as, do names, that is, what the Greeks called words, do names have a natural correctness, or are they merely by convention? Or do we know the things that are through names? That is language the matrix for knowledge? Yet on the other hand, the dialogue seems to take up these questions in a comic or even absurd way. Now, it's not a short dialogue, so we face the further question, did Plato lavish all this effort on some sort of extended joke? One way to take the dialogue seriously would be to look at the long central section where Socrates offers this multitude of etymologies, the various Greek words, and to look at it as a sort of Platonic dictionary. That is, as a kind of code breaker for our understanding of all of those words in the other Platonic dialogues. Now, to look at it this way would mean to assume that Plato composed all of his dialogues as a kind of system of thought, and that the Cratylus is the key to understanding that system and unraveling its code. Now, while this would be one way to take the dialogue very seriously, it would also ignore those fundamental questions that the dialogue poses, and it would ignore the very dramatic setting of the Cratylus, and indeed the dramatic settings of all the other dialogues. It would ignore the fundamental point that Plato wrote dialogues, rather than putting his thought into some sort of systematic form. So, for at least the time being, let's live with the apparent puzzle of the Cratylus. Now, the dialogue itself falls into three main parts. The first part is a dialogue between Socrates and his companion Hermogenes, in which Socrates appears to prove to Hermogenes that names, that is words, are by nature rather than by convention. The second central part of the dialogue is, as I mentioned, a long exposition by Socrates, where he shows what that natural correctness of names would look like through offering all these etymologies. But then in the third part, Socrates dialogues with Cratylus, and in that part he seems to show to Cratylus that the natural correctness or natural rightness of names is impossible. Now, the first part begins with Hermogenes, Socrates' companion, expressing his concern that names may not have a natural correctness. And Hermogenes is concerned that names have just conventional meaning on the basis of this argument. He says if we look around, we see that there are many nations, many different peoples, and these different nations and the different peoples apply different names to the same things. So, for example, what we call dog would be in Latin canis. So Hermogenes sees the differences among languages and concludes with some concern that names have nothing more than conventional meaning. Hermogenes also offers an analogy here. He says names are somewhat like slaves whose masters can change their names at will. So, in other words, he raises the possibility that all language is not only conventional based on our nation, but maybe that private language is the basis of all language. Language itself rests upon our will or wishes. In other words, rather than revealing being itself, language would only reveal my being. Now, Hermogenes is not happy with this conventionalist position. He wants names to mean something more. Now, Socrates moves Hermogenes from his conventionalist position by drawing out several of his beliefs. Now, in some, Hermogenes believes that there are such things as truth and falsity. He believes that truth refers to the things that are, and he believes that names, or words, are instruments that are meant to, as he says, teach and separate being itself. So, on the basis of this argument and these beliefs, Hermogenes concludes that in fact there is a natural rightness or correctness of names. Now, but what does this first part of the dialogue actually prove? Well, it doesn't prove that there is a natural correctness or rightness of names. What it does prove is that Hermogenes holds contradictory beliefs. On the one hand, he believes that names are conventional, but on the other hand, his same beliefs lead to the conclusion that names do have a kind of basis in nature. So clearly Hermogenes holds conflicting beliefs. Now also, in this section, Hermogenes tells us that he has many times conversed with Cratylus and others about the rightness of names, and now he wants to hear Socrates' view. In other words, he wants to be persuaded that names have a certain natural rightness. This desire seems to go hand in hand with what we could call Hermogenes' moralism. At one point in this same argument, he tells Socrates that he has, quote, suffered many times this, that I opine that there are certain very wicked human beings, and very many of them. He utters here the first oath of the dialogue, by the way, by Zeus. So Hermogenes' moralism goes hand in hand with the conclusion that the natural rightness of names is possible. Now, since this moralism seems somehow to be key to moving Hermogenes to that conclusion, which is also the point of view that Cratylus shares, that there is a natural rightness of names, perhaps that same basis is at the bottom of Cratylus' position as well. But let's compare what Socrates says. He says in this same section, I do not know in what way whatever the truth holds concerning these things, namely the natural rightness of names. So, in any event, given Hermogenes' conclusion that there is a natural correctness of names, Socrates then says, well, now it's my job to show what form this natural rightness of names takes. And that's what he does in the second section of the dialogue. But before we turn to that second section, let's jump ahead to the third and final part. This is where Socrates dialogues with Cratylus himself. Now, Cratylus, as I said, holds that position, that names do have a natural rightness or correctness, that words, in other words, express the truth, that through words we can know what is. And the basis, the kind of fundamental premise that Cratylus holds, is that words or names are instruments for the sake of teaching what is. Now, Socrates questions that fundamental premise by bringing up the question of the teacher, the person who came up with these names in the first place. So he asks Cratylus, for instance, well, what if that original name giver was confused? What if he or she made mistakes in assigning the original names? Or further, how did this original name giver learn enough language to be able to assign names in the first place? And he takes it one step further. He says that the original namer seems to contradict himself. For example, these fundamental names or words that they look at seem on the one hand to say that being or the fundamental beings are at rest, and on the other hand that they are in motion. So since language seems bound up with all these problems, perhaps something other than words reveal the truth. Maybe we learn without names, or by some means other than names. Now again, as in the first section with Hermogenes, what does Socrates prove here? They don't prove, or his arguments don't prove, that Cratylus' position is wrong. He doesn't prove that names are by convention only. Rather, his arguments again show that Cratylus holds contradictory beliefs. His fundamental premises, on the one hand, point to the conclusion that names do have a natural rightness, and on the other hand, that names don't. Or on the one hand, that we can know being through names or words, and on the other hand, that we cannot. So, to recap briefly, in the first part of the dialogue, Socrates convinces Hermogenes that names do have a natural correctness. In the last part, he argues to Cratylus that names don't have a natural correctness. So the dialogue as a whole is what we call aporetic. That is, the characters seem to be at a loss concerning the fundamental questions. They seem to conclude both that names are naturally correct and that they exist only by convention, and both that knowledge is possible through words and that knowledge is not possible through words. So what are we to make of this contradictory conclusion? Well, perhaps it points to a middle position as best. In other words, that names or words or language does possess some natural correctness, but is also shaped by convention. Or in other words, that names or words offer some knowledge, but not complete knowledge. I think it's in the central section of the dialogue, that long treatment of etymologies, that Socrates shows us how this conclusion could make sense. Now, it's totally impossible for us to go through those etymologies in any sort of fashion, even a cursory one. So let's just observe a few points. So for example, at one point, Socrates offers two etymologies for the word soul, which is psyche in Greek. The second etymology, where he says soul means nature holder, Hermogenes calls more technical than the first one, where Socrates said it means reviving. But Socrates says it would be laughable if the name were given so truthfully. So in other words, technical names, overly precise names, are laughable. Natural names, so to speak, are imprecise. Their very imprecision is part of their truthfulness. Take up another example. Just shortly thereafter, Socrates offers three etymologies for the word body, which is soma in Greek. The second of these, he says, body is derived from the word sign, which is sema, so soma from sema. Now, as a sign, it is what the soul uses to signify things, the body is. Now, names or words are the most obvious signs out there. So if we follow the analogy, the body would be to words as the soul would be to the meaning behind those words. Or in other words, names or words both show meaning and constrain it, just as the body reveals the soul and constrains the soul. Words would tell the truth and lie at the same time. One other example. At the very center, the exact center of the dialogue, Socrates takes up the etymology of the word justice. And he etymologizes it as that which passes through all things. Now, he says that many wise men agree on this meaning, on this characteristic of justice, that it passes through all things. But they disagree as to what justice is. So this is a place where he makes very clear that etymologizing is not the same as explaining, that knowing the etymology does not offer a full account. And later, Socrates etymologizes the word name itself, onyma in Greek. He says that name is a word that is compressed from a sentence, namely, that about which there is a seeking. This fanciful etymology suggests to us that a name is never the end or answer. It is the beginning of an inquiry. Now, how do we explain this wonderful power of names to reveal and conceal at the same time? Socrates gives us a hint in this etymological section. He swears an oath by the dog, and he compares the ancient name-givers to present-day philosophers. He says, their state of being turned around in a kind of whirlwind influences their explanations. This is perhaps the central insight of the dialogue, that one's own experience shapes one's attempts at knowing and naming. So reflecting on our experience and questioning it is the only path out of this whirlwind. And that reflecting and questioning takes place through language, the matrix of language. Now, there's much more that we could say about this wonderfully playful dialogue. In particular, it is important to note that in the central section, Socrates says that he is speaking under the inspiration of the wisdom of the prophet Euthyphro, with whom he had spoken at great length that morning. So in other words, Socrates connects the dialogue Cratylus with the dialogue Euthyphro. And by so doing, he connects the Cratylus with the Theaetetus, sophist statesman, on the one hand, and the Crito and the Apology, Crito, and Phaedo on the other, the dialogues that take place at the end of his life. Also, since he repeats this claim several times, it makes us wonder how seriously we should take these etymologies. And finally, it reminds us that whenever Socrates runs into seeming wisdom, his response is not to accept it, but to question it. I hope you enjoyed this brief introduction to Plato's Cratylus. Thanks so much.